Bloomberg is now on your dashboard. With Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, it gives you access to every Bloomberg podcast, live audio feeds from Bloomberg Radio, print stories from Bloomberg News in audio form, and the latest headlines at the click of a button with Bloomberg News Now. It's free with the latest version of the Bloomberg Business app. That's the Bloomberg Business app. Get it on your phone in the Apple App Store or on Google Play. Just download the app, connect your phone to your car, and get started. And it's all presented by our sponsor, Interactive Brokers.
Welcome to the Bloomberg Markets Podcast. I'm Paul Sweeney, alongside my co-host, Matt Miller.
Every business day, we bring you interviews from CEOs, market pros, and Bloomberg experts, along with essential market-moving news.
Find the Bloomberg Markets Podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts and at Bloomberg.com/podcast.
All right, let's get over to Washington, D.C. right now. A lot going on there as the government, as Congress, runs closer and closer to a shutdown. We have a serious upset, I would say, for Democrats in West Virginia. Nathan Dean joins us. He covers all things politics out of the Washington, D.C. Bureau. So Mr. Manchin is not running for re-election. What does this mean for the Senate, Nathan?
Well, it means pretty much the Democrats have a really steep uphill battle to keep the Senate in the 2024 elections. Look, it was going to be a challenge to begin with, but with Senator Manchin announcing his retirement, that essentially flips the state to the Republicans. And so, this election is very bad for those members in the Senate. There aren't many Republicans out there running for re-election that the Democrats could potentially have a chance. And that actually could play into what the Democrats do for the rest of the year before the election. We may see them focus more on confirming judges and confirming appointments and trying to get a lot of the cleanup work that they can do when you control the Senate before, they anticipate to lose it in the 2024 election.
I wanted to ask you about that, Nathan, because I think, a lot of us know Joe Manchin to be, a moderate Democrat is how he would describe himself. And on a lot of issues, probably leans a little bit more right than left. And would have thought maybe, if the Democrats could hold on to that seat, that this would maybe be viewed more opportunistically, perhaps, if you could get somebody who's like a little bit more in line with the agenda that you're trying to push.
Yeah, but you also have to answer the question of what would he do if he were to actually win re-election? Then, the makeup of the Senate could be, if the Republicans were to take the Senate with Senator Manchin there, he would lose a lot of that power as being that one kingmaker individual that can sort of go back and forth between the parties and try and appeal. So I think this is sort of also maybe, and this is just my own view, that maybe this is Senator Manchin trying to prepare for the future. He made that statement yesterday online how he wants to travel the country and see if there's a way to mobilize a centrist third-party run. I don't think that's going to happen. Again, that's just my own personal view. So I just think that he saw the future and was like, you know what, maybe the future is better for me working outside of Congress than being inside, because if the Republicans do take the Senate, he may actually not have all that much stuff to do.
All right, let's talk about the Congress here. Mike Johnson has, 7 days left before a government shutdown. Does he have any plan to stop that?
So, what we've just heard is, there's really two options on the table. One is a clean continuing resolution. This other idea, and this is the one that I think he's going to go with initially, is this idea of a laddered continuing resolution, so that he would extend funding for certain agencies to, say, January 15th, and then funding for other agencies to February 15th. So then you would have a rolling set of potential government shutdowns, depending on which agency you're impacted by. We are actually telling our clients that we still think it's around a 40% chance of a shutdown next week. I know that doesn't sound like in line with the news headlines that are coming out there, but there are just too many political cakes that are being baked around. Ukraine, Israel, House GOP ideas, border security, and none of these ideas are actually close to fruition, and they need more time for negotiation. And so ultimately, I think what will happen is that next week Speaker Johnson will pursue this laddered CR. It won't go anywhere with the Senate, and then they'll entertain this idea of maybe kicking the can down the road another 4 weeks or 8 weeks to give those ideas more time to fight, or to be closer to finalization, and then kick the can on the bigger fight, because there's really no strategy yet of why you would shut the government down. Most government shutdowns, a party goes in there and says, we want to close the government and get this in return? And that just doesn't exist. So I think the Republicans need a little bit more time to figure out what that is. And so I think ultimately they'll just kick the can down the road.
Kick the can down the road. Isn't that the famous phrase of this whole exercise that we've been going through for, man, when was the first one now? Or the potential one? Was it end of October?
You mean in this Congress?
In this, the beginning of October, right? That's when
yeah.
that was potentially getting going.
Yes,
again.
and the debt ceiling debate.
Right. Okay. So we've kicked the can to now. Okay. All right. Just had to catch up on the timeline there a little bit, Nathan. It's been a lot to keep track of. When Mike Johnson emerged as the Speaker of the House, were any of these proposals on the table at the time? Did people potentially catapult him into this position because they had confidence that he could avert a shutdown?
No, I think it's just more of, look, the way it works in Washington is, and this my view is that it's almost like water taking the path of least resistance. Until they get backed into political walls, politicians on both sides of the aisle will try and figure out flexible ways of moving around. And I think that's what Speaker Johnson is trying to do here, is just trying to figure out a way to keep the momentum going without being backed into a political wall. And so, obviously he's got members of his caucus that want him to try and get all these policy goals. It will never happen if you have the Senate or, the Democratic control. And obviously President Biden would have to sign off on it. So the odds of all that happening are almost nil. So how do you get out of that? Well, you kick the can down the road and you say, you know what, rather than making the tough decision today, we're going to make the tough decision the next time. Now, I think Speaker Johnson has a mulligan here because this is the first time he's done this. And it was such a quick time between the election of his speakership to today. I think after he pursues this laddered CR, he can go to his caucus and say, look, we tried. There's still a lot of ideas out there that we have some issues on border security that we're negotiating with the White House on. Let's just move this fight to either next year or later in December, and then we'll have our fight then. The other thing to just point out is that, the election that happened in Virginia and in Kentucky and so forth wasn't exactly a good night for and Ohio, wasn't a good night for the Republicans. Why would you, if you're the party that's seen as shutting the government down, want to have two bad whammies over a series of 2 weeks? I think it's more sense to just kick the can again down the road.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, maybe Johnson gets a mulligan, but the Republicans don't, because they already kicked the can once and then fired McCarthy for it. He is the one who took us through the debt ceiling deal, which was way back in May. So they've been, kind of stuttering and starting all year long without getting a lot done. By the way, speaking of getting little done, it seems in a recent poll that American voters are more concerned about border security than they are about, Israel, Hamas, and Ukraine, Russia. What's the Biden administration going to do about it? I mean, they've arguably had years to deal with it and haven't.
Yeah, so obviously the Ukraine-Israel issue is something that's a little bit more bipartisan, at least in the Senate. And so I think they're going to be trying to work that out. There are negotiations going on in the Senate over border security. President Biden even just said a couple of days ago that they're open to it. And the reason why I think he's saying they're open to it is this is one of those issues, like you pointed out, that, voters may not be too thrilled with his position going into an election year. So why wouldn't they do something? So, but ultimately what we're telling our clients is if you look at what has to happen between now and the 2024 elections, once we get through this funding fight, there's really not a lot left on the table. The debt ceiling isn't all that much, isn't there until after the election. So there's nothing really scary for markets outside of this geopolitical issues. So markets could have some clarity once this funding in Ukraine and Israel issues goes through, because 2024, a lot more focus is just going to be running for re-election.
Nathan, thanks so much for joining us. Pleasure having you as always. Nathan Dean from Bloomberg Intelligence, where he is senior policy analyst for the U.S. government.
You're listening to The Tape. Catch our live program, Bloomberg Markets, weekdays at 10 a.m. Eastern on Bloomberg.com, the iHeartRadio app, and the Bloomberg Business app. Or listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts.
Maybe Mick Mulroy knows. He's the co-founder of the Lobo Institute. We love to get his insight on what's going on in geopolitics, especially in the Middle East, because he's senior fellow at the Middle East Institute. But he is a Marine. You don't say former Marine, do you, Mick? Isn't it once a Marine, always a Marine?
That's right. The Commandant actually passed a rule that once a Marine is always a Marine. So we're just Marines.
All right. Well, we thank you for your service and congratulate you and your brothers and sisters on this, the 248th birthday of the United States Marines.
Absolutely.
I want to ask you about, first off, the situation in the Middle East and how it's developing now, because, on October 7th, I think nearly everyone was shocked and horrified by the attacks of Hamas on the Israeli people. And it seems that many people since then, or the voices that support the Palestinian cause and even support Hamas have grown louder and louder. What do you think the national feeling is now about this Israeli-Palestinian war?
So I just simply don't understand the people who support Hamas. That would be the equivalent, at least the way I see it, is supporting ISIS, essentially depraved terrorist organization. Now, being concerned about the Palestinian people, I think, is not only understandable, I think it should be the case. So I think there is the balance, because war is ugly, but it has to be fought within certain bounds. And we've set that internationally. And I do think, everybody's jumping to the conclusion that the Israelis perhaps went too far. I think that's to be determined, but certainly the level of civilian casualties is unacceptable. As Secretary Blinken said, I would share that. But now we're seeing a lot of things done to move civilians to the south to get out of the area of the most significant fighting, which is important. I think there should be set up a safe zone where people can receive food and water, and it's monitored so that the Hamas fighters can't hide amongst those folks. But we're going to see an increasingly violent fight in Gaza City. It's already started, but it's far from over. And that objective of the Israeli Defense Forces is to destroy Hamas. And that can only be done up close and personal.
I do want to come back to Secretary Blinken in a moment. But first, Mick, would love if you could tell us a bit more the perspective that you're coming at this from. I see that you worked at the Department of Defense, so you were the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Defense for the Middle East in the federal government, and now you're a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute. Can you just tell us what that means and what your role is right now?
So I started, for the most part, as a practitioner of irregular warfare in general, as a Marine, and then as what's called a paramilitary officer in the CIA, which is our version of the special operations in the agency. So I spent most of my time in conflict zones, as did most of my colleagues. And I fought many times in urban environments, and it is by far the worst. It's very disoriented, it's very violent, and you just never know what's coming at you. So that's what I brought into being a policy person for Secretary Mattis and then Secretary Esper, was mostly a practitioner's point of view. But then I got obviously schooled up pretty quick on policy. So I view it from both lenses when I look and analyze these type of conflicts.
Thanks for that. Yeah, I think I was definitely wanted to know a bit more about your background here. Very impressive. So you were also a former coach at USA Boxing in the Marines for a few years. So very impressive pedigree. And I wanted to echo Matt in thanking you for your service as well.
A few years in the Marines from 1988 to 2014.
That's
solid.
More than a few. Yeah. So you certainly have a lot more to bring to the table than we do in this perspective. So I did want to come back, to Secretary Blinken's visit then, and what you made of his time in the Middle East and how his reaction was, and where basically the U.S.'s role is in this conflict right now.
So I think one of the roles that the U.S. is attempting to play is to talk about the day after. This is going to happen. I believe Hamas will be destroyed, as they should be. But what's going to come next? A long-term occupation of the IDF of Gaza would be unacceptable to many, and I don't think it would be in their interest. So what's going to fill the gap? I think Secretary Blinken's been talking to all our partners in the region, saying, rhetorically, having opinions on this is fine, but what are we actually going to do? So is there going to be an international peacekeeping force? What's going to be the political way ahead for the people in Gaza, the Palestinians? What are we going to do to make sure that this never happens again? Both for the sake of Israel, of course, and for the sake of the Palestinian people. And I think everything that I've seen Secretary Blinken saying is indicating that is really where he wants to focus this. How to reduce this human tragedy that's happening in Gaza and eliminate Hamas, and also look at what's going to come next to make sure it doesn't happen again.
Now, Mick, a lot of people would say Israel has occupied Gaza for quite a long time and continue to do so through October 7th. They certainly have occupied the West Bank in a large part and haven't honored any of the attempts at a two-state solution, not under Netanyahu, right? So is there any hope that they're going to do that now? Because everyone else in the world backs a two-state solution, even the countries like the U.S. that back Israel and send Israel billions of dollars every year, and yet the Israelis refuse to allow the Palestinians to have their own state.
And the only way I could see this ever working, where you don't have this happen again and again, is a two-state solution. They have essentially, to your point, they have direct access into the West Bank and therefore occupy it. They control in and out access in Gaza. They would say they didn't occupy it, which is one of the reasons why they didn't know what was going on.
They have settlements, they have checkpoints.
They do. They absolutely do. Yes, I'm not disagreeing with you, but they would say that they want to have troops on the ground now because they don't want Hamas to get reconstituted. I think that would be a bad idea. That's why I think Secretary Blinken, State Department, the White House is rightfully talking about, well, what's the alternative? Is there a caretaker type group, an international peacekeeping force that could stay there until the Palestinian people select a government that sets up its security, it sets up its basic life support, and then of course there should be large investments from a lot of the wealthy countries in the region and out of the region that help rebuild Gaza and turn it into a place that has a future, including an economic one. And I think that's what the U.S. is pushing now, and I think they should be, because this situation I don't see changing unless there is a two-state solution in which the international community is heavily involved in setting up.
Are we losing sight of what's going on in Ukraine through all this? Because if the Russians win there, they're pushing up into NATO borders.
They absolutely are. And the fight's still raging on in Ukraine, even though it's not first thing on the news. It's still happening, and they are making incremental gains. And it's really clear now that a lot of the weapon systems that we provided them recently, especially the ATACMS, the long-range artillery system, is having a major effect on the Russians' ability to resupply both its frontline troops, and they can reach anywhere in Ukraine now with those systems. So there's no place off limits, including the Crimean Peninsula. So that is super important. It's also really important that we get more funding to them to purchase and buy ammunition, because as this gets into the winter, it's going to be somewhat of a war of attrition, particularly on the logistical side. And the U.S. needs to help them keep up with a much larger, much broader enemy in Russia.
All right, Mick, thanks so much for joining us. Always love talking to you, and really appreciate your service. I think especially at times like this, we should all be thankful that Marines like yourself and soldiers that defend the freedom of America are doing what they do so that we can sleep safely. Mick Mulroy there is co-founder of the Lobo Institute and a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute.
You're listening to The Tape. Catch our live program, Bloomberg Markets, weekdays at 10 a.m. Eastern on Bloomberg Radio, the TuneIn app, Bloomberg.com, and the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Matt Miller here with Molly Smith and the Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. I want to bring in Margie Patel. She is a senior portfolio manager at Allspring Global Investments, and we love to talk to her because she has a great view of the stock market and also of the bond market, right? She was twice nominated Morningstar's Fixed Income Manager of the Year.
Yeah, that's right. And Margie, it's nice to talk to you again. We used to talk when I covered the credit markets. I think you were back at Wells Fargo at the time, so good to see you.
Well, let's get your take on what happened yesterday, Margie, and what we've seen in yields and how it's affecting stocks. I mean, after the auction, it didn't go wrong, but it didn't go great, right? Of yesterday of the 30 years, we saw the yields spike up and then the stock market sell off. I think Powell kind of confirmed what the market was thinking, that maybe they're not quite done yet. How do you see it?
Well, I think the Fed is saying a lot of different things because in their whole tightening program of the last year and a half, nothing has really played out the way they thought, according to their playbook, as far as raising rates. We haven't seen the economy slow down. We actually had a very nice quarter just reported. Probably thinking was we would have a recession, lower stock prices, and that really hasn't worked out. So I think the Fed is a little bit flummoxed because what they thought would happen just hasn't happened. And I think it shows you that the economy really isn't that sensitive to what the Fed has done with interest rates.
Well, I think that was also a big point of what Powell was saying yesterday, that he had mentioned, there are so many people right now in the U.S. that are just so more or less interest rate agnostic, especially if you're a homeowner who's already locked in a mortgage rate under 4% or so. So that was definitely part of what he mentioned. And I think otherwise, my take on what he said yesterday, I'd love to hear your perspective on this. It seemed like he just kind of like flipped the script a little bit on what he had said at last week's meeting. That last week's meeting was more, we're probably done, but we could hike again. And yesterday was more, we could hike again, but we're probably done.
Well, I think he's just trying to cover a broad scope of what they might do. And really the market isn't giving them the guidance that they wanted. So I think that's why they sort of sound as if they're all over the map about, well, maybe we'll do more, maybe we're done, maybe we're not. And that really reflects the fact that their playbook hasn't worked out. The economy is too strong and inflation has come down, maybe more than they expected. The economy's been stronger than they expected. And so we haven't really seen much happen, and we haven't had interest rates really break out. Yesterday rates were up, today they're down, and you can see the market is just not taking, you might say, all that talk seriously. So we still have a very good stock market, and I think that's what we're going to see for the rest of the year.
So what about the Fed and its fight against inflation? I've heard an interesting thesis in the last couple of days that we were dealing with inflation that had a 2% ceiling, and now we're looking at an inflation environment with a 2% floor. Of course, we're not near that floor yet. If you take, if you're looking at any of the data that the Fed looks at, how do you view the fight against inflation?
Well, honestly, looking at the inflation data you've seen, which basically we had some short-term things from COVID, supply glitches, but really I can't see much connection between what the Fed has done and what's happened to inflation. Inflation went up as they began to tighten. It's come down. And if you look at the factors that have caused inflation to come down, I can't see very much of a connection with the Fed's activities. So I think it's the economy is going on. The Fed is doing their thing of raising rates, and it's almost as if it's a random effect on the economy, maybe a slight negative because there's a little uncertainty.
Well, but that sounds like bad news ready to happen, because the Fed has raised rates 550 basis points, and I guess those long and variable lags are starting to hit home, right as inflation is coming down. I guess fortunately, but aren't we going to see a slowdown in the economy?
Well, we really haven't seen it yet. And we've had an economy that looks okay, and it looks like the fourth quarter is going to be modestly positive again. And so I think if you had asked the Fed, where do you think the economy would be? I think they were looking for unemployment to have jumped up by several million people, not to be where it is, a little under 4%. So that was their whole key in bringing down inflation. So we've had very low unemployment rates, yet we've had inflation come down. So I just conclude other factors in the world have pulled inflation down. The basic strength of the U.S. economy isn't that sensitive to interest rates because business and consumers have taken out long-term fixed rate loans, and so they aren't sensitive. And so the Fed is really just almost a bystander to what's happening in the real economy.
Couldn't you say that?
Fighting the inflation, I don't see what they've done to fight it. I think they just have sort of hoped if they raised short rates, inflation would come down. It's come down not because of short rates, but all these other factors that have come in the marketplace.
Well, couldn't you say then, Margie, it sounds like some of the things that you've just mentioned right here between like the consumers still staying pretty strong, like inflation is coming down, granted not as fast as we might hope. Economy is still doing okay. Couldn't you say that that's maybe the making of a soft landing? Is that how you're positioning this right now?
Well, I think it looks like the economy, I don't see anything way out of kilter that would precipitate a recession. People have been looking for a recession for a long time. It hasn't come. I do think, though, that we've had a huge lift of the economy that's come from federal spending. We had the COVID money, which is still out there being dispersed, being dispensed right now. We've had a big increase in state and local government spending. And so I think that's added a little floor to what we may have seen growth come down. So as we get into 24, we may see the economy decelerate a little bit because some of these money flows, particularly the leftover COVID money that's been really a big boost for consumers, may stop, and that may cause the economy to slow down a little. But I just don't see a recession in the cards even for 24.
Margie, great to get your take. Thanks so much for joining us. Margie Patel there. She's a senior portfolio manager at Allspring Global Investments, and she does not see a recession on the horizon, even if the economy will slow down in 2024.
You're listening to The Tape. Catch our live program, Bloomberg Markets, weekdays at 10 a.m. Eastern on Bloomberg Radio, the TuneIn app, Bloomberg.com, and the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
We welcome now our TV and radio listeners, our TV audience and radio listeners. We need to talk about what's happening in the EV space. EV maker Polestar, fresh off its investor day, a day that showcased its business strategy and future EV prototypes. We now welcome Thomas Ingenlath, Polestar CEO and Bloomberg's resident. It says gearhead, but electric cars don't have gears, so we'll maybe park that name for now. But Matt Miller joins us. Thomas, great to see you. Thanks for joining us. What's the message that you are sending to investors? What do you want to convey about where this business goes next?
Yeah, good morning, Guy. Hi, Matt. Well, our message here from our Polestar Day, how we call it here in LA, it's I think, a very positive, good one. We have two major parts here. One, of course, the great news about the product rollout, and the other part about what work we have done over the last summer about the business plan. Obviously, making that a strong, resilient business plan, which means clear view on the break-even, cash flow break-even, 2025. So what I would call in a very short distance, very much in sight, 2025 cash flow break-even, and the funding need that is needed from today till this break-even, a very clear defined amount of 1.3 billion, which we want to cover with a mix of debt and equity. So what I would call a very manageable funding need. These two are the key cornerstones of this business plan, which I think everybody would acknowledge is not based on dreamy, fancy production numbers, but really a very realistic and achievable volume.
Thomas, let me jump in and ask you about those production numbers, because you've scaled back your 2023 production forecast a couple of times already. Now you expect to make 60,000 vehicles in total this year, but you need to get up to, I think, 155,000 by 2025. How are you going to make that leap from 60 to 155 in the next couple of years?
Well, yesterday people were queuing to get a ride along in our Polestar 3 SUV and in the SUV coupe, the Polestar 4. Both cars are ready to go out. The Polestar 4 actually has production start next week. The Polestar 3 will start production early 2024. So 2024, we will get these two cars in our hands. 25 will be a year where they will be fully in customer delivery, plus the Polestar 5 joining. So 3 great cars in the exclusive segment. So this product lineup, of course, is a big reason for our increase of volume in this period.
Thomas, you just called your products exclusive. What we've seen today is Richemont, the owner of Cartier, warning that they are seeing a significant consumer slowdown at the upper end. You've got Diageo warning that its premium products are starting to hit price resistance. We're seeing it all across the luxury sector at the moment, that the consumer is saying, I can't afford that anymore, even the upper end consumer. Are you seeing any evidence of that? Are exclusive EV products going to face the same headwinds that the rest of the luxury sector might be seeing at the moment?
I think it's very important to put that in perspective. I think there's no doubt that the long-term success of electrification is given. The only way of CO2 emission reduction is via EVs. Transition from combustion engine to EVs is a clear path forward. Short-term, economic fluctuations. The industry has seen that over decades. I think the real question is, how resilient are you as a business to go through those? And I think us having presented this business plan is a clear testimony of Polestar being on the side of the winners to go through those downsides and just simply be resilient enough to get out as a winner in that. So for that reason, I don't think there's any question about the EV success in the long term.
Thomas, you've just talked to us about your new business plan that you presented and said you need $1.3 billion. You're very specific about what you need to be cash flow break even in 2025. You need that externally, that funding. Are you in talks with any external investors? What kind of outside investors do you want to hook up with? And has anyone expressed interest?
Well, look, we were always very clear about the openness to attract outside investors. Our two main shareholders who have been and will be very supportive in our business, of course, will stay with us, but they are very willing to have others participating in the ownership of Polestar. And that's how we plan ahead.
So Volvo and Geely, do you think the other investors, could they come from China? Are you in talks with other Chinese investors?
No, we are worldwide pitching for this, so there's certainly no preference in any regional destination where these people should come from. No, we are here, obviously, today in the US. We have US production with the Polestar 3 starting. I think that is as well a very clear sign that we are an international business open to international investment.
Thomas, you flagged the fact that you have US production. President Biden has, within the last couple of days, signaled his support for the UAW to start targeting businesses like Tesla. He thinks that maybe that's the next place that they should be looking. What do you think about your labor? Do you think you could be facing strikes? Do you think you could be facing a union push? Do you think this is going to be something that pulls in the whole of the automotive sector in the United States?
Well, not really that much the question to us, because we have a very simple way of having basically no manufacturing footprint on our own. We have contract manufacturing with our big partners in that. Obviously, the Volvo factory in Ridgeville, we have production together with Geely. And this is where, of course, this question you have now should be targeted. We are very well familiar with factories, with unions. We have, obviously, in Sweden, a very strong base as well with manufacturing in Volvo. So I think that's really no question mark from our side onto that.
What is the Polestar, the unique selling point? Because, some brands, Porsche is about, speed and sports cars. Mercedes is about kind of luxury and status. Volvo is about, safety and family, at least for me. What is Polestar about?
Polestar main differentiator clearly is our design focus. It's a brand with strongest design as advanced as its technology. That's our slogan. And I think yesterday at our Polestar Day, when you see the lineup of the beautiful cars and how innovation is brought to the customer through our design made it really desirable. I mean, that is how we think electrification will succeed. Cars that really make people are passionate about. And what is the greatest driver for passion is clearly the design aspect of it. So if you ask us to narrow it down to that one aspect, it's design.
Thomas, great to catch up. Really appreciate you joining us from Los Angeles. Thomas Ingenlath of Polestar. And of course, our thanks to Bloomberg's Matt Miller.
All right. Well, if you were just joining us here, you were just listening to Matt Miller and Guy Johnson. They were interviewing the CEO of Polestar. And Matt, I believe that you've driven a Polestar recently. Can you tell us about two?
Yeah. So, I mean,
Really?
I drove the Polestar 1 was, I think, really amazing from a design perspective. It checked every box, and it was cool in that it was a hybrid and it had manually adjustable Öhlins suspension. That's something you don't see in cars these days. 2, it's not terribly luxurious, it's not over-engineered, and it's $50,000 in white, so it's a concern.
Does it have that CarPlay feature that you were asking our good John Tucker about earlier?
You can use CarPlay, but you have to plug it in. So it doesn't have wireless CarPlay, and it's made in China. So I think they're going to have difficulty selling that vehicle in this country. You know, Chinese cars that come in here are subject to a 27.5% tariff.
Yeah.
So they can't beat anybody on pricing. But it'll be interesting to see the 3 that'll be built here in the U.S. in South Carolina, as he's saying. The Polestar 4 is going to be built in Korea, and then they're going to have another car. So it'll be interesting to see how they do with, the Swedish/Chinese ownership.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's something fun to consider going forward. So thanks you and Guy for talking and for bringing us that interview.
Thanks for listening to the Bloomberg Markets Podcast. You can subscribe and listen to interviews at Apple Podcasts or whatever podcast platform you prefer. I'm Matt Miller. I'm on Twitter at MattMiller1973.
And I'm Paul Sweeney. I'm on Twitter at PT Sweeney. Before the podcast, you can always catch us worldwide at Bloomberg Radio.